Thank you very much. So we've got a panel discussion now about supplier relations. This is 3 people on stage talking, but it doesn't need to just be that. So please feel free to submit any questions on Slido and feel part of the conversation. Obviously, if you're one of the people in the room, there's a microphone somewhere we can give you. I know we don't need a microphone to speak to each other in the room, but it helps with people on the stream. If you don't have the app on your phone and you're in the room, on the back of your pass, there's a QR code. You can just scan that and that will make it work. So we will bring our guests on stage and we'll start our discussion. We're happy to go now? Great, cool, okay. So we've just met Carl. We'll meet him again. Carl Thompson, thank you very much. Yeah, thank you very much. And David Loseby from Barker's Commercial Services. So, Carl, one of the things you mentioned in your talk was that supplier relations is actually one of the most important parts of your ecosystem.
Yeah.
Without meaning to sound too obvious, why?
Just because, and sort of the last 18 months really highlighted it for everybody really, is that if you can not control the suppliers, but have some control over that supplier relationship, by finding the right supplier more quickly, but also treating them in an ethical way and a fair way to give them business, because the community of suppliers is only there because they also have suppliers and they also have customers. So I think on a sort of organic basis and on a global basis, it's only right that an efficient software system is in place to help drive those relationships.
David, do you have anything you'd like to add on that?
No, I think for me certainly. Maintaining relationships is hugely important, and for anybody that's heard me sort of speak in the past, it's probably one of the things I've always majored on, which is about the relationships that we develop, encourage. For me, in a sense, and this speaker's probably not going to like this, but for me, in a sense, it's more important than the system itself, and way more important. For me, okay, the architecture's got to be right in the digital system without a shadow of a doubt, so to remove those what I call frustrations. But looking at it from both I'll call it the user, but also I'll call it the driving sort of team, in a sense, that are behind those systems, it has to work for them too. So when we consider these things, for me, it's about considering all the different aspects of the people dimensions within a digital ecosystem. It's hugely important.
Yeah, and people being hugely important to the relationship itself as well. Is it easy, have you seen it happen, that people kind of forget that their suppliers and their partners are humans as well, and they're not just a number on a spreadsheet? And does that, if you manage to build and maintain that personal relationship where you can pick up the phone and call them by their name, does that make life easier?
Unquestionably, in my mind. In fact, I'd almost sort of say that it needs to be part and parcel of the architecture. So some of the things that I've certainly done in the past is to actually ensure that there is time, I'll call it time for relationship building within a, how can I put it, I'll call it contractual relationship, because at the end of the day, that's where we end up. But actually creating that time such that somebody can then build a relationship with somebody, whereby, I've seen instances where, having built that relationship up, somebody can then go, I need to send them a message because I'm not sure that's really what they're asking for, or that's what they need, or actually, this is a bit out of character, this doesn't sound right, or actually there's a better way of doing this. I will tell the supplier, or I'll tell the buying organisation, there's a different way of doing this. And I think it's through those sort of interactions that for me, and it is another way in which certainly systems then start to learn and think about different ways through algorithms that there is a requirement to do something different. So some of the digital systems that I put in, whereby we've utilised by permission, so this is back to the ethics of how you use a system, that we've actually worked out the dwell time and some of the issues in terms of utilising a system where they do and don't work well, just by being able to understand what's happening in the operating platform, and therefore where the likely, I'll call it, log jams are in the way in which that system then gets used or mobilized. And I think that's hugely important, but it is incredibly important that that kind of thing is done in a way that is respectful and ethical to both sides of the equation. Hugely important that people understand that you're doing that, but that's the reason why you're doing it, is to actually improve the experience.
Yeah.
I agree. I mean, one of the things that struck me about being part of the session yesterday with Ninian from Vodafone was that the organisation is looking to implement some kind of automatic negotiation step with the contract in with the supplier by a bot, effectively. And this actually made me think a little bit more about that, because that removes some of the human element that's absolutely essential. Like you just said, it's at the end of the day, these are still people at the other end of the phone, or the other end of this tender that you're pushing through, and they have a business to run as well, and they may be SMEs that you know this deal might make or break them. So you have to be aware of that. The software does not absolutely fix everything for everybody. There still needs to be the human element, which is great, keeps some of us in jobs, and that's absolutely the way that we need to keep it.
Vodafone obviously know what they're doing. Ninian obviously knows what he's doing. However,
don't tell that. Yeah.
I do wonder whether people will just learn to game that in the same way as people can bully self-driving cars, because if you know it's going to stop, you can just walk out in front of it. If you know this machine's going to negotiate with you, then surely you just quote more.
Yeah, and it's just the interesting thing is you know, when you get a bot versus a bot, what happens then? Because people versus bot, people should always win, right? But not always, and so that's an interesting time ahead in the future, and I'll be watching that with great interest.
So we're talking about negotiations and contracts really, if you take the legal side out of it, it's just setting expectations of the relationship, right? So how rigid do you find a contract needs to be? Do you prefer more fluid contracts where there's kind of room for a bit of change, or do you like things to be absolutely nailed down?
It really depends, I think, from my point of view, as to what it is the contract is there. If it's a supply contract of some kind of product or service, and you're not a legal person, then the shorter the contract, the better. Absolutely, because firstly, you have to read it, you have to sign it, and they've got some sort of flexibility in there, great. If it's for some kind of life-critical service, and you know there needs to be, and there's a risk of being sued, then everything needs to be watertight. You know, grey area contracts and don't help anybody. They usually end up in problems for both parties. So for me, I think there isn't a one-size-fits-all type of contract, but obviously the contract managers that are in procurement teams tend to be the people that decide what level of detail needs to be in those documents.
My perspective, I guess, is similar, but I think I'll probably extend on that insofar as there's been a lot of discussion about creating more collaborative contracts, actually, and I'm a huge advocate of that, so I'll nail my colours to the mast right at the outset. But if you think about it in terms of, if you set a contract up that is predicated on penalties, as opposed to a contract that's set up based upon incentives, it drives the behaviour within the contract. So the recognition from my side is to make sure that we strike that right balance. I think back to the point that was made, which is if it's highly commoditised and we're purchasing thousands of these things, then you do want the repetitive consistency of what comes through with that. But if you're thinking about an outsourcing contract, or you know, a new building or something like that is completely one-off, the last thing you want to do is to sort of, I'll call it, be completely restrictive and put lots of penalties in there, because guess what? All that does is just set the relationship right from the outset, and for me, that is completely the wrong way to go. So I think all these things have their place, and I think the skill and the care is the way in which you deploy them. And you know, recently for another organisation that I was working for, you know, I talked to them about, so which of these are of strategic importance and require innovation, which are core to your business, and which are nuisance. So start to think about how you segment those different requirements within an organisation, and the way in which you then want that relationship to work. The other thing I would say to people as well is that in this whole process of, I'll call it, automating and digitalising what we have, the one thing that I would say to people is that at some point somebody has programmed, devised, architected the system, and guess what? It was a human being. Now, human beings have lots of biases, And guess what? We have to then make sure we understand what those biases are. Are the biases prejudicial towards the way in which we work as an organisation? And I think, therefore, you have to consider this very carefully in terms of where is it appropriate and where is it not appropriate to use those efficiencies, but also to the extent that, you know, as I said, if I look at it from the purchasing organisation's point of view, you have this perspective that says, if I was trained as a procurement professional or a supply chain professional, what is it I want to get out of this role that I'm doing? And you know, where's the buzz for me? Where's the, I want to get up in the morning, the alarm's gone off, it's 6:30, I want to get up, I want to get enthused and motivated. And if you're going to sit behind a screen 24/7, then I'm guessing that maybe that's not a good motivator. It certainly wouldn't be for me, but then maybe I'm just different. So we have to think then about how do we create that balance and create that equilibrium within the system that we're creating.
Yeah, and we're obviously discussing supplier relations here. We all like to imagine that everything's going to go swimmingly and everyone's going to be delighted at all times, but it doesn't always happen. What's your kind of first step process when things start to go sour? So maybe you've got some sort of life cycle management system in place, you start to see the KPIs aren't being hit, there needs to be a conversation. How do you approach that? Do you go in all guns blazing? Is it more of a kind conversation?
I think, you know, certainly to begin with, you wouldn't necessarily go in all guns blazing unless it had been a repetitive problem. So we found that our clients, certainly the users of our software, have tools at their fingertips which show how often it happens, how frequently, and to what extent is causing a problem. So for example, with suppliers that are maybe missing bits of information off documents that they're submitting, is that a big problem? Well, maybe not once, maybe not twice, but if they're doing it every week and it's causing you in the procurement team a lot of extra work to fill in all the blanks, or it's causing your AP team, when we're looking at invoicing, extra work because they can't pay you on time, and of course that has a knock-on effect back to the supplier. So they're kind of, you know, cutting off their nose to spite their face, because if they're supplying you dodgy information, that's going to cause a big problem for them with the cash flow, so when they want to get paid. So again, tools that help analyze the severity of it would certainly help the teams behind that decide, do we just give them a gentle nudge? Do we ring them up? Can we meet face to face? Hopefully again, yes. Can we have some kind of procurement review or supplier review, and then decide how we want to move this relationship moving forward? If they're repeat offenders, you know, there are plenty of other suppliers hopefully out there in the market that will jump in and help. So they're going to lose business. So for me, it's, yeah, absolutely softly first, and then, you know, take severe measures if they refuse to adhere to them. Yeah.
Do you have anything to add?
I suppose, again, probably like as ever, my perspective on this, which is, again, back to the context. I mean, I've just come out of an aerospace and defence organisation whereby probably 12 to 18 months is probably the pre-qualification period to get suppliers in a regulated industry. So switching a supplier out is no simple task, and it's not something you do very lightly. So the object of the exercise is about engaging them with that supplier to understand, you know, what has gone wrong, and actually, have we caused it? Is it our fault? Is it because we've given them some misinformation? Is it because actually we've changed I'll call it the demand schedule several times over, and the supplier's going, well, what do you want? Because you've changed it 3 times this month already. So I think it's about understanding the totality of the situation rather than necessarily reacting or responding to the metrics. I mean, I suppose the analogy I would use is the metrics are probably 2-dimensional. The discussion and the understanding is 3-dimensional. So I think it's about, that's where for me the crossover point comes. It might be a sort of almost a bell that says you need to go and look here and find out what's going on. I think that's probably what it should be, rather than it immediately initiates Mr. Supplier, you've now failed, you know, you've now down on your KPIs, we're now going to deduct this payment. For me, that is something that I would never ascribe to, because, as I said, I think that in the whole objectivity and in the spirit of trying to collaborate and innovate and push things forward, we should, as purchasing organisations, recognise that we may have some culpability in what has happened, and therefore understanding that without precipitating then a very adversarial situation, then it's hugely important that we don't do that. And I think that's where, for me, the constant push around getting procurement professionals to understand that actually the relational and the people skills are so important. And for me, have always been way more critical than what I would call the system and process type attributes. I think that's where we had a huge amount of value, and I think that's why procurement as a profession will remain exciting, and has a place in the modern world that is likely to sort of endure, but there will be operational elements that are absolutely appropriate for that, but there are other parts that clearly aren't. And I think it's up to us as leaders to decide, where that divide sits for each business, each sector, etc.
There's a huge overlap, isn't there, between procurement and the finance division of a business. So I used to work in packaged goods, and we would buy the raw materials, we'd make a packaged good, and we'd sell it to a shop. And we had customers, I'm going to be very careful not to name anything here, we had customers who we were genuinely convinced their process for paying a bill was wait until they chase it. And that soured the relationship for us with the buyers within those businesses. And actually, we were a small business. That business is still going. They're very successful. I'm very happy for them. But it can be crippling. Certainly, if you've invested a lot of capital into an order. So, is a lot of relationship management with your suppliers actually a bit of internal relationship management as well?
100%. I mean, I kind of alluded to it during the discussion, is that, you shouldn't overlook that communication internally is a reason why systems like this tend to fail. And the classic one, and I say 15 years experience in this P2P, we've had rooms full of people where, they've almost been, pulling punches with each other. When you get finance and procurement in the same room, they never really get on. It's a bit like the cat and dog relationship. And it's unfair to blame either side, really, because there are equal problems which, they're quite happy to throw at the other side. But yes, so procurement sort of get frustrated because suppliers are shouting at them because they won't deliver because they're being paid late. But the reason they're being paid late maybe is because of some misinformation on the invoice, which means it goes on stop. So again, making sure that those procurement teams can speak to those accounts payable teams and get on. This is the organizations we find are the most successful, are the ones where you have a joined up discussion internally. Usually maybe one person is in charge of both teams, then you've kind of got a common message between both teams. You tend to find that they have less supplier issues just because they have less internal issues.
Yeah, it's very true. I mean, I've seen situations whereby, it sounds quite strange actually, simply driving to another physical location as we would do in pre-2019, and going into the accounts payable office and saying, so tell me, where's all the stress and the grief? Which are the suppliers that are just awful to deal with and why? What can we do differently to help that? And what do suppliers do to actually make your life miserable? And so understanding that wider context, we had one supplier, believe it or not, I think I'm right in saying there was something like 2,400 invoices per annum that we would get from one supplier. And I said, this is just sheer madness, this is just lunacy. So I took it upon myself then to have a conversation with the supplier. The supplier said, well, I didn't realise we were doing that either. Who's doing that? So just by having that mutual conversation that said, actually, we can save you a lot of money by stop issuing an invoice about once a day. In fact, several a day, because 2,400 is many a day, from different locations that they were dispatching goods. And they said, wow, we didn't realise that we were doing that. And they said, thanks for helping us. Because we then got to a position whereby they invoiced fortnightly and they consolidated the invoices. We agreed that we would do reconciliations if there was mismatches retrospectively. But out of that, the supplier then said, right, okay, as a consequence of that, we can now do this, we can pass on some of that benefit to you. We're now assured that you've got your eye on it and we're now going to get paid on time. We've now got an arrangement whereby actually we think you're now one of the best customers that we've got. So guess what? We're now going to put an account manager on it, and we've got this R&D pipeline. Are you interested in this? So suddenly by changing what could have been quite an adversarial situation, just by going, let's have a conversation, guys. Nothing to do with the system at all, but that's about then saying, I understand what's happening in that whole ecosphere. Accounts payable then go, cool, you're a hero, aren't you? You saved me all that hassle, and the finance director's not come down and said, we need to take people out the accounts payable team because you've asked for more MI and information. So we can now provide more predictive information and actually more value add to what you're now doing in the procurement department. Oh, we've never had this dialogue before. And it's just that sort of simple conversation and understanding something from somebody else's perspective rather than your own. So I think there's a lot in that human interaction again that has huge amounts of untapped value. And it's interesting how many conversations that I've had, probably a dint of the number of grey hairs I've got, where people go, well, I just assumed. And you go, right, okay, then let's start with so how does it look and feel for you? Rather than let's just assume. So I think there's many things in that really do help relationships. And back to the point earlier, which is, no matter how much you automate it, that's never going to pull those kind of things out. But that's then down to the thinking and the way in which you then interact with individuals and understand where the issues are and the value that can be created then for an organisation. So that for me, in some ways, is about, that's procurement's raison d'etre. It's not just pure cost savings. There can be other ways in which that can be. And oddly enough, then in times when supply is an issue, guess what? You're our preferred customer. We'll make sure you get your orders. So, there's a funny way of how these things sort of start to then provide a huge incremental value to the organisation.
It's funny, it always seems to go back to people and treating people like humans and having a nice conversation with somebody about something.
Yep.
Perfect. It feels a shame to cut this short. It feels like we've just started, but we've already run over time somehow.
Okay. Well.
So David Loseby and Carl Thompson, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you to everybody in the room. Thank you if you're watching on the stream. We are going to go and get some lunch. If you're watching at home, head to the microwave, and we'll be back in about an hour. Thank you.